5-миллионном городе вот сюда вот пришли только вот полсотни человек.
Viktor Yanukovych not to sign an association agreement with the European Union.
І атакують. Одна з машин таранить барикаду Євромайдану. Люди просто розлітаються. Ті, хто стоять нижче, вже за хвилину закидають БТР коктейлями Молотова. Чи врятувалися ті, хто керував машиною, невідомо.
What's going on, guys? Hope you're all doing well. I want to front load this in the beginning by saying viewer discretion is heavily advised. So if you're not prepared for that, if you're sensitive to these things, or you can't handle that, you're a little wah-wah baby boy, then please click off the video and find something that fits your maturity level. But if you can handle all that and you're okay with all that, then please, by all means, continue watching. I need the views. Thank you. As well as forgive me for horrifically butchering all of the names involved in the story. I'm probably not going to get many of them right, if any at all. So, with that being said, we're going to be talking about the Euromaidan protest, or revolution, or the revolution of dignity, whichever you want to call it. Why am I talking about it? Well, given the fact that Ukraine has been in the mainstream media more than ever, beyond the initial invasion days, I'd like to clear up some rumors, kind of re-educate and re-inform people, and remind them as to what actually happened and what led to all this. That being said, we're going to start with the Ukrainian election of 2004, which I would argue is the origin and the starting point of all this, and what led to everything that you see happened in the last decade or so. In 2004, Ukraine would hold a pivotal election, one that would ultimately have an effect only truly felt a decade later. Running in this election, Viktor Yushchenko against Viktor Yanukovych. The first round showed a win for Yushchenko, his 11,188,675 votes to Yanukovych's 11,008,731. But after the second round of voting, inconsistencies were noticed, and an attempted assassination on Yushchenko via dioxide poisoning would ultimately sway the election in the second round. Yanukovych suddenly gained a massive influx of new voters. The final results showing that he had nearly a unanimous vote throughout all regions except one. Some recorded a 127% turnout rate and a 98.87% vote in favor of Yanukovych. An investigation was launched where clear signs of fraud and intimidation were found, swaying the election ultimately. The final rerun found Yushchenko to be the true and final winner. Yet it took nearly 3 months and the Orange Revolution for Yanukovych to concede and step down. This would be the start of Ukraine's slow descent into madness. Now, through 2005 to 2010, at the end of Yushchenko's election cycle, his presidency can pretty much be summed up with one word: drowning. He absolutely drowned in corruption. It was in every region and every aspect, top to bottom, floor to ceiling, mostly leftovers from the old USSR days, including oligarchs who probably propagated a lot of that corruption, as well as constantly being pulled from the east to the west and from the west to the east, made running a functioning government and presidency borderline impossible. So as hope would dwindle and frustration would arise, it seemed that another election cycle was going to be totally butt-fucked by corruption and oligarchs. So it's safe to say people weren't too thrilled about this next election cycle. Now going to the 2010 election, this time, good old-fashioned, everybody loves him, everybody knows him, Viktor Yanukovych against Yulia Tymoshenko. Wouldn't you know it, Viktor Yanukovych wins. A lot of people believe this was yet another rigged election and was set up in favor for Yanukovych, but there was an investigation to a degree, and for as much corruption and intimidation as they did, it really wouldn't have swayed the election that much. So Yanukovych goes on to be the 2010 election winner, and ultimately would make such a titanic storm within the country that he would later be deposed and forced to flee the country in exile. Now, Yanukovych would spend the next 3 years of his presidency desperately trying to hold on to power, being constantly pulled towards the east by Putin and constantly being pulled towards the west by his people. Now, a major decision would arise during his third year of his presidency, specifically about EU membership. Though seen as pro-Eastern and predominantly pro-Russian, a good percentage of people truly believed that Yanukovych would actually sign this deal, as it seemed universally beneficial for everybody and everything in the country, and as we all know, he wouldn't go on to sign that membership bill. So on November 21st, the legendary Euromaidan protest would begin. Starting with humble beginnings, the protest originated with around 50 to 100 people, generally around college age to early 30s. The main reason for them being there was obviously to integrate Ukraine into the EU, though in just a little over a week, his very humble and small protest would eventually swell and grow into a full-scale revolution. On November 26th, the final decision would be made as to whether Ukraine should join the EU. As corrupt as Yanukovych seemed, and as many believed he would go through with the agreement, late into the night of the 26th, the decision was made. Ukraine would not join the EU. Disappointed, the Maidan protesters would continue marching and protesting until their demands were heard. On the 30th of November, at 4 a.m., the attitude would change. The protests went on as usual, but this time, Burqa riot police appeared at the protest. Armed with metal batons, the Burqa began to beat the crowd with not an ounce of mercy. Women, men, young and old, didn't matter. Everyone was getting attacked. The beating did not relent. If you fell, you were beaten by everyone that passed. If your head was exposed, then your head would be cracked with a baton. Kicking, stomping, punching, and beatings became the only aim of the riot police. Many suffered severe injuries and permanent damage to their body, to sicken not only the protesters, but the whole country. On December 1st, the protest had evolved into a new form, a much larger and intimidating one. The memories and wounds of the 30th attacks are still fresh, and the first round of anti-protesting laws motivating old and new protesters. The crowd began to swell into the hundreds of thousands, and even as high as 500,000. Spilling out of the Maidan, the crowd begins occupying the Presidential Administration building on Benakova Street and the Cabinet building on Hereshkovo Street. The Maidan was expanding and growing at a rapid pace, while becoming more united and organized. 4 p.m. on December 1st, the first major clash happened on Benakova Street. A mix of peaceful protesters and what many believed were Tatushki, or hired thugs. Aligned with the security forces, some speculate it was the first movements of the right sector, looking to ratchet up the violence in order to bring more members in. Who was it? Well, that isn't fully known, and many have speculated for well over a decade now on who it was. That being said, the protest was now taking a violent turn. A commandeered bulldozer was used against the Burqa line, and a select few protesters began attacking the Burqa, giving them just cause to begin throwing tear gas and stun grenades and shooting rubber bullets, pushing the crowd back to the Maidan. The first of many bloody days was far from ending, but so the fight for freedom began. So on the latter half of December 1st, towards the end of the day, into the night, it was clear that this protest was no longer going to remain peaceful. It seemed that they've had just about enough of being attacked and pushed around and lied to. It was time to fight back in their eyes. So they began growing in size. As the crowd inflated, they began to spill out outside of the Maidan, taking more positions and taking over more governmental buildings. These included the city council building as well as the trade union building. Various attacks would occur throughout the night, little skirmishes, kind of tit-for-tat battles. But eventually, late into the night, the protesters would seize an absolutely tantalizing opportunity. They managed to let the Burqa push forward, thus isolating themselves and separating themselves from their main group, and the protesters noticed this, and they took full advantage of this. So while this Burqa unit began defending a Lenin statue, isolated and alone, the protesters closed in on them and proceeded to beat the ever-loving piss out of them, severely injuring several of them and hurting a lot others, but inevitably pushing them back towards their own lines and forcing them into a retreat, to which then they 180'd and went right back to the Lenin statue and knocked it over and proceeded to smash the head off of it and break it up into little pieces. December 10th to December 11th. The first major attempt to disrupt and break the Maidan up was conducted on the night of December 10th at 10 p.m. However, the initial attack wouldn't commence until 1 a.m. Burqa began slowly approaching the protesters in Institutska Street, breaking down barricades and pushing protesters back as they went. At 1:37 a.m., protesters found their footing, locking arms in one giant human chain, hell-bent on stopping the Burqa from moving forward at all costs. The life of the Maidan hung in the balance. Just as it seemed to be the end and the wall would collapse, more people showed up to defend the Maidan. At this moment, the crowd broke into a collective orchestra singing the national anthem. Their strength and numbers surged, allowing them to beat the Burqa back, and for one more night, the Maidan would survive. So after that harrowing defense and battle on December 10th and 11th, we're going to jump ahead to January. January is undoubtedly the major turning point within the protest. It is when the violence became near epidemic within the protest, and it was clear that this train was not only heading west in a hurry, but was about to derail, slide right through a daycare center, and hit a fucking senior citizen home. That's how quickly this was spiraling out of control. The Maidan protest would continue relentlessly throughout December. It actually grew exponentially as the months went on, seeming as if the colder it got and the more people got hurt, the more people showed up. Somehow the government didn't realize that part. Again, minor attacks and skirmishes would continue throughout the month, but protesters would remain steadfast in their defense of the Maidan. They were not going to give up on this. They seen the moment. They had their little 8-mile lose yourself moment, and we're not going to let this opportunity slip away. So upon the new year, Ukraine and the rest of the world would slide into the new year of 2014. Unfortunately, what the Maidan was before would soon become a distant memory, and the new form it would take on is much darker, bleaker, and well, unfortunately, a whole lot fucking bloodier in the next coming weeks. So on January 16th of 2014, Yanukovych's brilliant idea to stopping this protest and putting a halt to it was to pass the infamous anti-protesting laws. Now, these laws were seen as draconian at best. They were nationwide laws that were going to be put in effect to essentially fuck with the protesters and give the police more of a reason to arrest them before they even get to the protest or while they're at the protest. Generally, these laws included a whole list of things that really made no sense, but some of the ones that really pissed people off was the fact that you couldn't wear helmets at protests. In addition, the one that really set people off was the travel bans that they instituted with these laws. Now, what these travel bans included was you couldn't go to one location in a group with more than 5 cars. And this was nationwide, and it didn't matter if you were going to a wedding or a funeral. The law still applied. So rightfully so, nobody was too thrilled with these laws, and this ultimately is what caused the Euromaidan protest to grow into a full-blown revolution. Beyond the attacks and the beatings that people received, it still was relatively small. It still only had a few thousand people showing up daily. But once these laws were put into place, it went from a few thousand to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and then eventually nationwide in the hundreds of thousands. One group in particular, though, that was solely dedicated to protesting these anti-protesting laws would find itself at the Maidan, generally setting up near, I'm going to pronounce this way wrong, Hereshkovy Street, I think. Close enough.
Hrashevsky.
This additional group of about 5 to 10,000, give or take, was there solely to protest the anti-protesting laws. And the way they did this was in defiance, they would essentially break all of the laws and would do it by any means necessary. So if they couldn't wear a helmet and they didn't have a helmet, well, then they would put a colander on their head or pots and pans. Though their maybe ideology or political leanings weren't on the same page as the Maidan, they seen that they had a common enemy. They eventually were rolled into the greater Maidan protest, thus expanding their lines to a whole new street in a whole new direction. And this is the day that the Euromaidan protest would become and be famously known as the Revolution of Dignity. It was after they were rolled into this group and their size increased and their territory increased, they now seen the opportunity to have a full-scale revolution. January 20th to January 21st. January 20th would see a large uptick in violence, located generally around Hereshkovo Street, outside the Dynamo Stadium, where 10,000 plus protesters would clash with police throughout the night in escalating levels of violence. Tit-for-tat exchanges would escalate as protesters threw bricks and Molotov cocktails at police, and police returned fire with their own bricks and their own Molotov cocktails, as well as stun grenades and tear gas, rubber bullets, and even water hoses, which at the time were forbidden due to the fact that the temperature was below 0 on average. This would come to a head when protesters erected a 8-foot trebuchet out of materials they scrounged locally within the area, used to launch rocks and Molotov cocktails at police from much greater distances and with better accuracy. Day by day, the battlefield was looking more and more medieval. Into the early hours of the 21st, anti-protesting laws would take legal effect over the country. country. Following was an order from Yanukovych ordering a bloody crackdown on the Maidan, allowing police to now use excessive force, quote-unquote special devices, and firearms at their discretion. January 22nd to January 25th. January 22nd would take a dark and deadly turn for the revolution. At 6 a.m., 2 protesters would be shot dead by live ammunition, one of them being Sergei Nagoyan, a 20-year-old ethnic Armenian and Euromaidan participant, respected and loved by protesters as he appeared nearly every single day, helping wherever and whenever he could. He was shot dead by a shotgun, being struck in the head, neck, and chest. Panic ensued upon the shooting, and protesters began retreating, allowing police to reclaim lost territory. A brutal battle would erupt as police began firing rubber bullets and throwing explosive devices indiscriminately into the crowd. First reports of police using live ammunition and modifying stun grenades with nails and shrapnel to make them more lethal are coming to the media. Medics and journalists were not spared either. Protesters reported that the police fired randomly into the crowd regardless of the target or where the shot would land. Over 300 were injured and 4 were shot dead by police that day. On January 23rd, a shaky ceasefire was put into place to allow for negotiations to continue. During this time, a video would leak to YouTube. The video in question showed a prominent leader of the Audiio Maidan being shuttled out into the cold, naked, and for display of protesters. Clear signs of a beating showed on his skin, with large bruises and blemishes visible. In retaliation to this, the construction of new barricades and reinforcements began that day. From January 24th to January 25th, negotiations continued under relative peace. However, the protesters remained unbroken in their demands and wouldn't settle for half measures or phony promises made by the government. Sadly, the bloodiest days were soon to come. February 18th. Start of the bloodiest days of the Maidan would begin. On the night of the 18th, a fierce street battle would take place. The battle raged into the early hours of the 19th, when protesters were pushed all the way back to the Maidan Square. All of the Maidan's forwardmost positions and barricades were destroyed or taken over by police. This would be the last line of defense. Knowing this, they fought hard all throughout the night and into the morning. The fate of the Maidan seemed bleak and quite possibly found its expiration date. The fight slowed down, and by the end of the 19th and into the morning of the 20th, this uneasy standoff would be broken. But the bloodiest moment of the Maidan, February 20th, would be remembered for the sound of sniper and AK fire in a last-ditch attempt, security forces brought in Crimean police units to make one final crackdown on the protests. Protesters were shot at random by police using AK-74s and snipers from various positions. Footage of this brutal attack would make it to the internet, stunning all observers. Reports showed that a majority of the protesters were shot in the head, lungs, heart, and even eyes. Few would survive these attacks. Many were unarmed or lightly armed with basic shields and sticks. This moment would define Ukrainian identity as the fearless people who brought sticks and shields to a gunfight and won. So, after that very dark and very twisted ending to the revolution, safe to say people were pretty disillusioned at this point. I mean, they just watched their own government and their own police force pretty much gun them down in cold blood, and, well, not really seem to give two shits about it. On the night of February 20th, Yanukovych, now realizing that, well, he can't buy his way out of this problem, he can't lie his way out of this problem, and he certainly can't shoot his way out of this problem, fled the country in exile, fleeing to Russia, where I'm sure Putin set him up with a nice, beautiful estate in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere. But that unfortunately left the protesters to now process and mourn everything they just went through in these long and bloody 4 months. Discovering that Yanukovych had now tucked his tail between his legs and fled to Russia, protesters and journalists took it upon themselves to make a little pilgrimage to Yanukovych's private estate just outside of Kiev. There they would find a 300 million euro estate that he lived in with multiple floors, $10 million, or 10 million euro, I should say, chandeliers, a private golf course, you name it, he had it. It was like its own little city within a city. And this is a striking comparison to what the average Ukrainian lived off of at that time, which was about 200 euros a month. That ain't much. And this is where either Natalie or Natalia, I can't quite tell, but we'll just say Natalie because that's what it looks like when I read it. A Natalie Seldetska, this is where her and her team would not only discover but recover about a dozen folders containing hundreds of documents, essentially pinning Yanukovych to a litany of crimes. Everything from money laundering to corruption to fraud to embezzlement, and even a murder for hire plot. Turns out Yanukovych was on some fucking Joe Exotic shit and was trying to get his political opponents whacked. And in one case, he went through with it. In the case I'm speaking of, the attempted murder case of Tatiana Chornovil. Chornovil, we got it, who in December of 2013 was chased down, dragged out of her car, beaten nearly half to death, and then left in an ice-cold ditch to die. Fortunately, she survived this ordeal and would go on to make a full recovery and be okay, thank God. But it was clear that between Natalie and Tatiana's experiences and what Natalie discovered and what Tatiana experienced, that Yanukovych was behind a clear murder-for-hire plot. Unfortunately, Yanukovych would receive not one singular iota of punishment for any of these crimes and would get to go live on happily ever after somewhere in Russia. But as many know, and unfortunately, what followed this moment of triumph over their government was quickly dashed by a very long and complicated decade of very bloody war, would eventually lead to an even bloodier war and a full-scale invasion just about a decade later. So the final death toll is as follows. For the protesting side, they had 108 dead and 1,100 plus injured, with an additional 77 arrested. For the police and security forces, they had 13 dead, 272 injured, and 67 captured, ending with a whopping 121 dead, 1,811 plus injured, just for 4 months. 4 months of back and forth battling with sticks and shields and rocks led to nearly 2,000 injured and a whopping 121 people dead. So the moral of the story is the cost of democracy is as follows. It's the only thing that's free when you have it, but when you lose it, well, it only has one price: blood. So with that being said, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for listening and taking the time out of your day to watch this video. And as always, if there's anything I can do to make this better, anything you want me to talk about, anything you want to hear me say, please leave a comment below and let me know how I can improve this or make it better. That being said, thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.